One of the biggest changes under Trudeau has been migration. His government significantly increased the number of permanent residents admitted into Canada. In 2022, Canada received a record number of around 400,000 new permanent residents. Immigration targets also rose sharply, moving from around 200,000 in 2017 to 400,000 in 2022, before being reduced later because of pressure on housing. Profile of immigrants also changed. There were more temporary foreign workers, more international students, and more people transitioning to permanent residence. The logic behind this policy is that immigration supports population growth and helps fill labor shortages in a country that is aging. Since 2015, Canada's population has grown much faster than before, reaching an increase of 3.2% in 2023. Economically, Trudeau's record is more mixed. At the start of his mandate, he promised a return to balanced budget. In practice, the federal deficit grew $19 billion in 2018, and the gross federal debt increased before the pandemic, rising from about 30% of GDP in 2015 to 41% in 2020. This was mainly due to higher social spending, infrastructure investment, COVID-19 relief, and green policy measures. Since 2021, the federal net debt has fallen again into around 31% of GDP. Real GDP growth has been moderate, around 0.5% in 2023. But because the population was growing so quickly, GDP per person actually declined. At the same time, unemployment remained relatively low during most of Trudeau's years in office, averaging around 6%, which is better than the roughly 7% average under Harper. However, housing inflation became one of the most serious problems, with prices rising sharply and affordability becoming much worse. Housing is probably one of the clearest areas where the pressure has been felt. Despite announcements of social housing funds, tax incentives, and mortgage support programs, the supply of housing has not kept up with demand. In major cities, the average home price nearly doubled between 2015 and 2021. Critics argue that the government failed to solve the housing crisis, even though it repeatedly promised a national housing strategy. On the social policy side, Trudeau did introduce important measures. One major example is the Canada Child Benefit, which helped reduce child poverty. He also expanded some social programs and placed strong emphasis on inclusion and equality. However, not all promises were fulfilled. A national pharmacare system was promised but never fully implemented. Some of the broader goals, such as easier access to family doctors and more complete expansions of public health coverage, also remain unfinished. So while there were real social gains, there was also a gap between the promises and the results. In the labor market, Trudeau's government introduced or supported several reforms, including stronger parental leave and labor-related protections. But there has been no major drop in unemployment as a result of these policies. Wage growth has been modest, and in some periods it has not kept up with inflation. One explanation for this is the increase in labor supply caused by immigration and international students. More workers means more total employment, but it can also limit upward pressure on wages in certain sectors. Trudeau also promoted multiculturalism and inclusion very strongly. He presented Canada as a diverse and open country, and his government often emphasized bilingualism, cultural recognition, and diversity in public life. Supporters see this as a strength of Canada. Critics, however, argue that this approach sometimes ignores assimilation and weakens social cohesion. There is no simple number that can measure multiculturalism directly, so the effects are often debated and interpreted differently depending on political perspective. The economic impact of immigration, which is one of the most debated issues, the general conclusion from research is that immigration supports economic growth rather than hurting it. The Bank of Canada has noted that recent high immigration levels increased the non-inflationary growth rate by expanding the labor force. New arrivals also increase consumption, which supports demand in the economy, and many of them bring savings or access to credit that helps drive initial spending and investment. At the same time, immigration increases pressure on housing because housing supply does not grow as fast as population. That is one of the main reasons why rents and home prices have been pushed upward. In statistical terms, Canada's population has been increasing faster than its real GDP. That means total GDP has gone up, but GDP per person has stagnated or even fallen slightly. In other words, the economy is growing, but not fast enough to fully match the pace of population growth. Employment has increased strongly, with hundreds of thousands of new jobs created since 2015, but this does not automatically mean living standards have improved at the same pace. The labor force participation rate also rose slightly, showing that more people are working, but wage gains have remained under pressure. Regionally, the effects have not been equal. Provinces such as Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta, which receives many immigrants, have seen strong labor force growth. But they also face some of the worst housing affordability problems. Some rural and manufacturing regions, on the other hand, believe they are not benefiting enough from immigration and would like to see more newcomers directed there. A related claim that often appears in public debate is that immigrants do not contribute economically. That claim is not supported by the research. Immigrants make up a significant part of the workforce and also contribute to demand in the economy. In fact, in some sectors such as manufacturing and scientific services, a large share of workers were born outside Canada. Bank of Canada and the Parliamentary Budget Office both indicate that immigration supports long-term growth by expanding labor supply. It is true that there can be temporary statistical effect because many newcomers begin with lower salaries, which can reduce average productivity measures at first. But that effect tends to fade as immigrants settle, gain experience, and integrate into the labor market. In fact, the income of newer immigrants has improved over time. So while immigrants also use public services, they clearly contribute through work, taxes, consumer spending, and economic activity. The idea that they bring nothing economically does not match the evidence. Another controversial issue is the claim that certain forms of caste-based discrimination have been imported into the Canadian workplace, especially within some South Asian communities. Canadian human rights law prohibits discrimination based on ancestry or place of origin. In Ontario, caste-based discrimination has been recognized as illegal, including actions such as denying promotions, assigning unfair tasks, or harassing workers. There have also been real cases, including a recent decision in British Columbia, in which an Indo-Canadian employee received compensation after being harassed with caste-based insults. Some community research also suggests that Dalits in Ontario face discrimination in interviews, wages, or workplace treatment. The scale of this problem is not well documented, and it remains debated. Authorities tend to prefer education and enforcement of existing human rights laws rather than creating a new legal category. So while individual cases of caste discrimination do exist and should be taken seriously, of course, not all of Canada's current problems can be blamed on domestic policy alone. Some are the result of global events such as the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, supply chain disruptions, and rising interest rates. These factors affected inflation, supply shortages, and labor market conditions around the world. Trudeau's supporters also point out that social programs such as the Canada Child Benefit reduced child poverty and that his government promoted equality and inclusion for women and minorities. They argue that Canada remains economically stable with relatively low unemployment and strong quality of life indicators. At the same time, critics say that alarmist Political rhetoric often exaggerates the situation. Claims about runaway crime, economic collapse, or total social breakdown are sometimes made without solid statistical proof. It is important to separate real policy failures from exaggerated political messaging. Trudeau's Canada is neither a complete success nor a total failure. His government expanded immigration, strengthened some social programs, and promoted inclusion, but it also faced major criticism over housing affordability, debt, and the gap between promises and results. Immigration has supported economic growth, but it has also created serious pressure on housing and wages in some sectors. The real challenge for Canada is not to reject immigration or multiculturalism, but to manage them better, with stronger planning, fairer distribution, and policies that match population growth with infrastructure, housing, and labor market capacity. But that's just my opinion. Thanks for watching the video and take care.